Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. My name is Brian Liddy. Sadly, or not sadly, but unfortunately, we don't have Andrew Wilson as I said we would have earlier on today when we covered the First Minister's keynote speech to conference. So I'm afraid you're stuck with me again tonight. We'll start the programme as usual with a coronavirus update. As of 2 p.m. today, a total of 3,671,148 people in Scotland have been tested through the NHS Scotland labs and UK government regional testing centres since the start of the pandemic. Of these, 2,946,165 have been confirmed negative. 724,983 have tested positive. There are 2,244 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed by a test, although not everyone with the virus will display symptoms and not all of those with symptoms will be tested. There were no new reported deaths of people who have tested positive today. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 9,562. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 715 were in hospital last night, and 52 of those were in intensive care. As of 8 a.m. this morning, 4,345,855 people had received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination. 3,948,483 had received their second dose, and 1,659,464 have shared a third dose or booster. The latest UK daily figures show that 144,810 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness. That's an increase of 51 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just hospitals. I should have said earlier also that unfortunately we don't have a guest this evening, we're just going to do a read through of the headlines. The first of which is the Scottish child payment will be doubled in Scotland. The Scottish child payment will be doubled to £20 per week per child from April 2022. First Minister Nicola Sturgeon confirmed that more than 105,000 children will immediately benefit from the increased payment, which supports low-income families with children aged under 6. First introduced in February 2021 as a £10 per week payment designed to tackle child poverty, it provides regular, additional financial support for eligible families. The benefit, which is unique in the UK, will be fully rolled out to children under the age of 16 by the end of 2022, subject to data on qualifying benefits being received from the Department of Work and Pensions. It is expected over 400,000 children could be eligible for the doubled payment from that point. From 2023-24, it will represent an annual investment in tackling child poverty of around £360 million a year. The increase to £20 per week further underlines the Scottish Government's national mission to tackle child poverty. The First Minister said, "The Scottish Government is determined to lift children out of poverty. Of the £2 billion a year that the Scottish Government invests to support people on low incomes, over £670 million is already targeted at children." Through the range of new payments delivered by Social Security Scotland, low-income families receive in the early years of each child's life £5,000 of additional financial support. At the heart of this is the Scottish Child Payment, the only payment of its kind anywhere in the UK, designed to solely lift children out of poverty and give them better lives. The £10 per week payment for eligible children under 6 will be extended to all eligible children under 16 at the end of 2022. And we committed to doubling the payment of £20 per child per week within this parliamentary term. Next story. 6 cases of the COVID-19 Omicron variant have been identified in Scotland. 4 cases are in the Lanarkshire area and 2 have been identified in the Greater Glasgow and Clyde area. Public Health Scotland and local health protection teams are supporting, and contact tracing is being undertaken to establish the origin of the virus and any individuals they have come into contact with in recent weeks. Health Secretary Humza Yousaf said, "This will be a worrying time for the 6 people now identified as having the new variant. All will receive expert help and support, and Public Health Scotland will undertake enhanced contact tracing in all cases. This will help establish the origin of the virus and any further individuals they have come into contact with in recent weeks." Mr. Yousaf added that there is still much to learn about the Omicron variant. Questions remain about its severity, transmissibility, and response to treatments or vaccines, and scientists are working at pace to provide additional information. "Until more is known, we must be cautious and do everything we can to minimise the risk of spreading the infection," he said. The Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation, the JCVI, today announced that the waiting time was being cut for all adults, with priority for booking to be decided by the National Health Service. The JCVI said adults aged 18 to 39 should be offered booster jags and recommended cutting the gap between second and third doses from at least 6 months to at least 3 months. The JCVI also advised that severely immunocompromised people should be eligible for boosters 3 months after their primary course of 3 vaccinations. The committee also said 12 to 15-year-olds should be able to get their second COVID jag for the first time. Responding to the latest advice from the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation in response to the emergence of the Omicron variant, Chief Medical Officer Dr. Gregor Smith said, "We welcome the further advice from the JCVI on the COVID-19 vaccination programme and confirm Scotland has already started work on its implementation, including the recommendation that boosters can now be given to all adults no less than 3 months after a second dose. Urgent talks with health boards and vaccination partners are underway, and further information on the delivery of this advice will follow as soon as possible. In the meantime, we will continue to prioritise booster vaccinations for older adults and those in COVID-19 at-risk groups, working through the priority groups as we have done throughout the pandemic." Transport operators, unions and passenger groups have backed the return of mandatory mask wearing on buses and trains in England, but raised concerns about enforcement. Passengers will need to wear masks on public transport across England from Tuesday under measures to combat the spread of the Omicron variant of COVID-19, bringing England back into line with the other nations of the UK. Face coverings were made obligatory on public transport in England in June 2020, with fixed penalties of £100 for non-wearers. After the legal requirement ended last July, ministers said masks were expected in crowd transport settings. Transport for London said coverings remained compulsory for travel there, but there was little deterrent against not wearing them. The National Police Chiefs Council, the NPCC, said most cases of non-compliance across all settings were resolved by staff in the first instance. It said businesses and local authorities needed to remind the public of the rules, and enforcement should not necessarily mean police involvement. Unions, however, said the government needed to ensure there was credible enforcement and that bus drivers and rail staff were not asked to force passengers to wear masks. Unions said they backed the measures for public health, but were telling their members only the operator and police were responsible for making people comply. Unite's National Officer for Passenger Transport, Bobby Morton, said, "The government's previous and inconsistent messaging on face mask wearing is almost certainly going to result in a high degree of non-compliance. Unite's advice to bus drivers is clear. It is not their role to enforce mask wearing. Their responsibility is to safely drive and operate the bus." And for the next story, the SNP conference. Today was the final day of the SNP's second conference in 3 months. As well as the First Minister's keynote speech, conference resoundingly passed 4 resolutions. These were on climate change and the global ecological emergency, the preservation of inshore fisheries and aquatic habitats, the release by the UK government of COVID vaccine patents to support recovery from the pandemic in those nations struggling to secure adequate vaccines, as none of us are safe until we are all safe, and there was an emergency resolution to support the release of the Chinese journalist Xian Zhan from detention after her reports on the COVID pandemic in Wuhan offended the Chinese authorities. The First Minister's keynote speech to conference followed an unscheduled televised update on the emergence of the new COVID variant Omicron. In her keynote speech, the First Minister emphasised the importance of continuing measures to protect ourselves from the new variant, such as wearing face coverings in public spaces, maintaining social distancing, hand washing, ventilation indoors, and vaccination, most importantly of all. Of this, she said, "If you haven't yet been vaccinated, for goodness sake, just do it." As well as measures covered previously in this bulletin, the First Minister reiterated her plans for another independence referendum, saying, "In the course of next year, I will initiate the process necessary to enable a referendum before the end of 2023. All of this, of course, is COVID permitting. The First Minister also had a direct message for Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, saying he should let the people decide. For our next story, Keir Starmer has sparked a row in the Labour Party by launching a shadow cabinet reshuffle as his deputy was giving a major speech attacking corruption by the government. Allies of Angela Rayner insisted that while she met the Labour leader between her broadcast round this morning and her speech at 11 a.m, she was not told the reshuffle would be imminent or consulted about any of the details. One Rayner ally said, "Mr Starmer would have been fully aware the reshuffle would blow up her attempt to lay out plans for reforming the standard system and said it was not fair." A second said she had been gazumped and complained at the utterly bizarre timing. However, other senior Labour sources disputed Ms Rayner had been blindsided. One shadow cabinet minister insisted she definitely knew. Another insider said Angela Rayner met Keir Starmer in his office this morning and was told directly the shuffle would be taking place that day. Cat Smith, a shadow cabinet office minister in Ms Rayner's team, was the first person to announce they were resigning. She suggested Mr Starmer had offered her the opportunity to remain in her existing post, but that she had raised concerns about several issues, including the failure to restore the whip to Jeremy Corbyn. In her resignation letter, Ms Smith described herself as one of the few remaining Red Wall Labour MPs. Keir Starmer has put back winning Red Wall seats at the heart of his plan for the party. Jo Stevens, who had been tipped for a move, announced she was being shuffled from the Shadow Culture Secretary brief to Shadow Wales Secretary. Mr Starmer is seeking to capitalise on a series of Conservative backbench revolts Boris Johnson has faced in recent weeks, as well as on the apparent fading of the poll bounce the Tories gained from the initial vaccine rollout. Keir Starmer is understood to want to boost Labour's media standing, as well as promote some figures perceived to have performed strongly in recent months. He had hoped to carry out a wider reshuffle in May after the loss of the Hartlepool by-election, but more ambitious plans were stymied by a furious standoff with Angela Rayner over a change to her role. Rayner was giving a major speech on standards in public life this morning as news of the imminent reshuffle began to leak out and made clear she had not been consulted and she did not think it was the right thing to do. For our next story, senior French ministers have accused the UK of operating a labour market akin to slavery and called on London to open safe routes for migrants as the two governments continued to deflect blame for last week's drownings in the Channel. The criticism came hours after France's Interior Minister, Gerald Darmanin, had held a crisis meeting with European ministers and border agencies to discuss the migrant emergency around the Channel ports. The UK Home Secretary, Priti Patel, was disinvited to the meeting after Boris Johnson riled President Emmanuel Macron by publishing a letter calling on France to accept people being returned and calling for British troops or border police to patrol French beaches. Darmanin said, excuse me, cross-channel migration was first and foremost an English issue and the UK must accept its responsibilities. Today, people who want to seek asylum in England have no other means than to cross the Channel. This is because there is no legal way for immigrants to go to the UK and because you can work without identity papers in England and that creates a demand, Darmanin told BFM TV. He added that France accepted 150,000 asylum applications a year compared to 30,000 in the UK. France's European Affairs Minister, Clément Beaune, also hit back at the UK, accusing it of having an economic model of sometimes quasi-modern slavery that he said encouraged desperate people to attempt perilous channel crossings. Mr. Beaune said exploitation of illegal workers was more prevalent in the UK because there are fewer checks, and the UK needed more humane labour market regulations to discourage migrants. Priti Patel was due to attend the summit, but the invitation was rescinded because of Johnson's letter published on Twitter before it was seen by Macron. Afterwards, Darmanin said France and its EU partners were in agreement over new measures to clamp down on people smugglers. For our next story, the cost of producing green hydrogen with renewable energy is set to fall, and the capacity to produce in Europe and nearby countries will likely surpass current targets by 2030, European Union officials said today. Countries and companies have seized on green hydrogen, a fuel obtained by passing renewably produced electricity through water to split the element from oxygen, as a way to cut greenhouse gas emissions, especially from heavy industry. Until now, green hydrogen has been far more expensive than versions produced using fossil fuels, including the dominant grey or blue hydrogen that relies on natural gas. But the high gas prices, due to strong demand and lower stocks, have driven up the cost of making the carbon-emitting version, meaning the cleaner technology can start to compete. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said in Brussels, "The cost of emitting carbon under the EU's trading system has also hit highs, further increasing the cost of emissions early fuels and providing an incentive to move away from them, potentially allowing production of green hydrogen to reach the scale that becomes more economic." Because of the current rise in gas prices that we see, green hydrogen today can even be cheaper than grey hydrogen, Ursula von der Leyen said. In 2020, grey-blue hydrogen could be produced for around €2, that's $2.26 per kilogram, compared to as much as €6 per kilo for green hydrogen. Ms von der Leyen said the green hydrogen could cost less than €1.8 per kilogram by 2030, which was the goal that was within reach. The target hinges on a vast increase in production capacity from the roughly 0.3 gigawatts of electrolyzers that the International Energy Agency counts around the world. EU Climate Policy Chief Frans Timmermans said he expected the EU and its neighbours to surpass a target to install 40 gigawatts within the EU and a further 40 gigawatts in other countries to the east and the south by 2030. Next story. Belarus today announced joint military drills with close ally Russia on its southern border with Ukraine and accused the NATO military alliance of building up offensive capabilities near its border. US, NATO and Ukrainian officials say Russia has built up forces near Ukraine, sparking fears of a looming attack. Moscow denies any such plan. Belarus is itself locked in a row with the European Union over migrants camped at its western borders. casting it as a response to new military deployments in countries to the west and south of Belarus. Defense Minister Viktor Krenin said Minsk would hold an exercise with Russia in the medium term. He gave no specific date. We see troop formations around our state borders. We can only be concerned by the militarization of our neighbouring countries, which is why we are forced to plan measures in response, he said in comments to his ministry website. NATO member Lithuania, which lies to the west of Belarus, said on Sunday the Atlantic Alliance needed to adjust its stance towards Belarus, whose military, it said, was becoming more integrated with Russia's armed forces. On Monday, Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko said Minsk would not sit idly on the sidelines if the simmering conflict in eastern Ukraine erupted or a war broke out with the West at Russia's border. For our next story, the Scottish Government is providing funding of £30 million to support GP practices. Sorry, the voice in my ear? No? Okay. I've just been reminded that this is our last story of the evening. So, the Scottish Government is providing funding of £30 million to support GP practices to continue providing a high level of care to patients through winter and into the next year. The funding will help the provision of existing GP services, including supporting more face-to-face appointments, extra GP sessions, practice nurse time and non-core hours covering all appointments, more administrative time and practice manager time, organised cover for reflection, learning and innovation, external GP locum sessions, and Health Secretary Humza Yousaf said, the contribution general practice makes to the health and well-being of communities through continuity of care and meaningful relationships with patients is invaluable. We recognise that as face-to-face appointments have resumed and demand is increasing, surgeries are working overtime to meet patient needs. This support package will allow practices to target investment where it is most required to sustain the high levels of care they have always provided through what is likely to be the most challenging period in the history of the National Health Service. So that's the end of our read-through of the news headlines this evening. It's before I forget, it's perhaps worthwhile mentioning that if you are interested in finding out more detail of what was covered in today's SNP conference, and in particular the First Minister's keynote speech, then you might want to go back onto our website and have a look at a programme today that we did that covered that. And of course, it goes without saying that there is a complete back catalogue of every single broadcast that Broadcasting Scotland has ever done. So feel free to. Yes, and that does include, as the voice in my ear reminds me, that does include our full coverage of the entire SNP conference for the past 3 days. So before I go, I'll just remind you that. Yes, please support Broadcasting Scotland, as the banner says below me here on the screen. We cannot do what we do without your support. And if you do already support us by parting with hard-earned cash, then we thank you. We really appreciate that. But if this has been a tough month for us this month, we have a lot of plans of things that we would like to do, but we can only do them if we have more resources. At the moment, everything here. Yes, again, the voice in my ear has reminded me that a departure from the usual. Tomorrow for St Andrew's Night, we're going to have a musical. I want to call it an interlude, but it's not going to be an interlude. It's going to be a proper St Andrew's Night musical event here live from Cowcaddens after we've done the usual Scotland at 7. So thank you for your time. And thank you for your interest, and I'll say good night, and I hope to see you again soon. Good night.
What distinguishes Broadcasting Scotland from a website or blog, apart from our brilliant programmes?
Hi there, I'm Gordon Ross.
Are the costs we face to enable us to produce those programmes. These costs are significant and ongoing. However, our facilities are able to do so much more if only we had the staff. In the last year, some of our supporters have cancelled their subscriptions. In one way, we would prefer it if it was because they didn't like us, rather than it being because of the financial pressures which we are all under because of COVID. The really positive outcome of our fundraiser is that at a time of economic challenge in Scotland, we will use your donations to create jobs and in a small way contribute to improving the Scottish economy. If you want us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster, able to provide an alternative mainstream television platform, then please support us.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
Just imagine what we could do if we had even 1% of the BBC Scotland channel's budget. Imagine. And then please consider turning your imagination into reality. Please support us if you can afford it.